There is a growing chorus of influential voices who favour a sharp increase in British defence spending. Last week, for instance, Admiral Lord West said the UK should be spending at least 3% of GDP on its armed forces. The former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, suggested it ought to be more like 4%. Surely, at the very least, there's a strong case now for putting a stop to those planned cuts to the size of our army and indeed things like the number of tanks that we currently have. Well, joining me now is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and indeed former soldier, Tom Tugendhat. Tom Tugendhat, really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get into defence spending, can we just address what's been happening to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe? Wonderful news that she's been released. How much money do you think we've had to pay and where will that money go?
Well, we've been told that it's nearly $400 million and it's going on aid. Can only be used for aid purposes. Let's make sure that it remains the case. Sadly, we know that when the US handed over a similar sum, a bit more actually, for the release of other hostages who were kidnapped for ransom by the Iranian state a number of years ago, that money sadly was to a large extent used to murder hundreds of thousands of Syrians in the Syrian civil war. So we need to make sure that that money doesn't go to those purposes and that is indeed kept to humanitarian purposes.
It's a function, I suppose, of the times that we live in, and I'm not suggesting that the deal that's been cut with the Iranians has anything to do with maybe accessing their supplies and reserves of oil in the future, but it's certainly the case that the Prime Minister, who's in Saudi Arabia, has gone there basically to implore them to release more gas and oil onto the market. Sometimes when you've got a situation like the one we face at present, you have to enter into some fairly Faustian pacts with some unpleasant regimes.
Well, Colin, I've never been shy about saying it, and I know that you and I have spoken about it. My policy has always been to look after the interests of the people of our country and our islands first. I'm afraid that is literally the job of a British politician, is to serve our interests first. Now, that means making sure that we're able to protect our economy, protect our interests, look after the British people. But it also means that we've got to be careful about the deals we do today because they have implications tomorrow. And so when we're looking at these deals, we need to make sure we're doing deals that we can live with and that don't undermine our future security. A classic example of that, of course, is Germany's deal, sadly, dependency on Russian gas. It seemed like a sensible idea at the time because it was cheap energy. It doesn't seem quite so clever now.
Could you imagine, just a month ago, having a situation where you mentioned Germany, where they would announce, almost turning on a dime, rearmament on a massive scale, $100 billion of defence investment by a country which hitherto, for obvious historical reasons, was incredibly reluctant to increase the size of its military? What a transformation.
When Chancellor Scholz announced it to the Bundestag, when was it? Crikey, it feels like months ago. Actually, it was only about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was a complete surprise, not just to many members of the Bundestag, but many members of his own government, because he hadn't spoken to them about it because he was concerned about the reaction. Now, actually, this is really an example in Germany of green politics, not of SPD politics, because the German Greens have always been very active on human rights and on defence. It's a legacy of policies that led them into Bosnia in the 1990s. So it's a continuation for them of a tradition. But you're absolutely right. It's a really big transformation. I don't think it's been fully understood in the UK what a radical shift this is. Now, I was talking to the Latvian defence minister only a few days ago. They're going from about 1.2, 1.3% on defence 2 years ago, all the way up to 3% in coming days. And just in case you're wondering what others are doing, Estonia is about to buy, or rather has put in the order for, 60 F-35 jets. And just to put that in context, we have 48.
Wow. Well, that brings us on to our defence spending then. I talked to Admiral Lord West a fortnight ago, 3%. He said 3% of GDP is the figure, the aspiration that we ought to be looking at. Jeremy Hunt, people remember him as a former health secretary, but actually, of course, he was a former foreign secretary as well, talked about, he didn't name 4%, but he said we ought to be up to American levels of spending, in other words, 4% plus. What's a reasonable figure?
Well, look, this is something I address actually for the first time in a speech in 2017, because I've long been calling for the reality that we don't spend enough on influencing ourselves abroad. And while I have great admiration for Lord West, not everything we need to spend money on is steel. Actually, defence today comes in many different ways. We always talk about cyber, and cyber is, of course, enormously important. So spending on the agency, spending on GCHQ, on the Secret Intelligence Service and the British Security Service are very important. But here's the thing. So is spending on justice reform. So is spending on real diplomacy with weight. So is spending on trade policy, because building up trading partnerships that are able to resist the pressures of foreign governments who have, how can I put this politely, other interests and not just economic partnership, is an essential part of our defence. Now, none of this negates the fact that, frankly, an army of 72,000 is far too small. When I was helping on the Army strategy team, we fought a very strong rearguard action when the Army was going to be cut from 100,000 to about 80,000. We managed to get it to 96,000 instead. I won't tell you the ways in which we achieved it, but that was one of the things we fought. And I'd like to see the army going back up in numbers because, as Stalin put it, quantity has a quality all of its own. And we do need more ships, we do need more soldiers, and we need more aircraft. We do need to make sure that when we turn up in numbers and that we're able to match not just in skill, but actually, sadly, too often in size as well.
As you say, foreign policy isn't just all about the threat of bombs and bullets. There are different forms of persuasion, and sometimes it takes the form of blandishments. Nonetheless, there are people, and over the last week or two, who've looked, for instance, to take one country. If you look at the situation in Pakistan, Imran Khan, their prime minister, a formerly test-playing cricketer who's turned out to be something of a Putin, well, I was going to call him a Putin crony. That's not fair. He's making a deal with Russia for wheat and other resources, which he thinks are very much in his national interest. But by cozying up to Russia, he reminds people who are resentful of the fact we pay £250 million in aid, foreign aid to Pakistan, that maybe it's not necessarily money well spent.
Well, there are many people who look around the world at our aid spending and quite rightly are critical about elements of it. We need to keep it constantly under review. But let's not forget what we're spending aid money for. Of course, we're spending it to help education programs in Pakistan or, irrigation programs in other parts of the world or whatever it happens to be. And sometimes emergency aid in response to a hurricane or a famine or whatever it is. We're also spending aid money to make sure that we have access and influence in countries around the world. And I would argue very strongly that it is our fundamental national interest and the interest of the British people to make sure that our High Commissioner in Islamabad gets the opening and the reception that he needs. It's also, just by the way, in our national interest to make sure that Pakistan succeeds as a country. We have huge direct and personal connections between our country and Pakistan and India and Nigeria and many other countries. And so the idea that we can sort of cut them off or hope that it doesn't matter what happens there, I'm afraid it's just not true. And we need to deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it were. And so making sure that we have that influence is essential. I'm just going to pick up on a point, if I may, though, Colin, on a point that you were talking about wheat, because this is something that we've really missed so far in the Ukraine story. And I know you were touching on it just now, so I'm going to welcome your point. Ukraine grows about 12% of the world's wheat. Russia grows a further significant percentage, 5 to 7%, depending on how you count. Large numbers of countries like Lebanon and Syria get 100% of their wheat from Ukraine. Many others get nearly 100% of their wheat from countries like Russia. This war and these sanctions mean that not only is the crop not going in the ground or might not go in the ground in the coming weeks, because although the ground is currently frozen, it's hard to know where the tractors are going to come from to plough the soil because tanks are currently driving over it. Now, if we knock out 10, 12% of the world's wheat crop, corn crop, and indeed fertilizer, we are going to see very, very serious food price rises around the world, not just in the UK, where we're already seeing some inflationary pressure, but in countries like Egypt, where the last time there was huge price rises in food and basic products like cooking oil, we saw the Arab Spring, that was in 2011. In countries like Nigeria, where people are very often living on the breadline but have a very, very large population, we need to make sure that we are thinking about not just the migration that is coming out of Ukraine today and making sure we look after people there, but about the implications of food poverty around the world and what that would mean to human migration and human trafficking.
And the dozen farmers I joined on a Zoom call on Monday evening after this show, who were all very concerned that we only produce about 50% of the food in our own country that we eat, and they want to see more support for the British farming industry, would absolutely endorse that sentiment. Can we talk about Ukraine in a different way from this tack? We are united in our admiration for Volodymyr Zelensky. Rapturous applause in Canada, US Congress, as he repeated the request. He's not in a position to demand anything. The request is imploring Western governments to help provide a no-fly zone with NATO aircraft over Ukraine. Do you support that or not?
Well, I support his idea of air denial, which is what he wants. He wants to stop Russian planes attacking his people, and he's absolutely right, and we must support
that. With surface-to-air missiles.
The question is
to some degree, but
sorry, I think we're jumping over each other.
Sorry, Tom, I was just saying we can, to some degree, if it's air denial, we can do that with surface-to-air missiles, which we're already supplying, but that is very different from our pilots shooting down Russian pilots with all the potential subsequent escalation that goes there.
You're absolutely right, Colin. And I'm not in favour of our pilots going in there. First of all, there's several reasons. Let me start off. First of all, Stinger missiles can bring down anything slow or low level, so helicopters or transport aircraft. And the new Starstreak that I hope should be in place in the coming days can bring down literally anything at all, including fast jets. So the two of those should be able to provide a full air denial capability. And secondly, the reason I'm not in favour is because I don't think it is in Ukraine's interest for this to become a NATO war. The reason why is because at the moment, Russia is finding it very, very hard to mobilise public opinion in support of this war against their Slavic cousins, against Ukraine. They're finding it very difficult to get people in Russia to be supportive. And you're seeing this in the extraordinary courage of protesters and indeed, as you saw yourself, a TV news producer who held up a no war sign. If NATO were to be involved, I have a concern that what we would see is a whole of government, a whole of nation response to it from Russia. And I fear that that would make it worse for Ukraine, not better. And there you go. You're showing this extraordinarily courageous producer who's now disappeared, sadly, almost certainly imprisoned by the Russian state. So, I think the most important thing we do is make sure the Ukrainian people win. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that they have the capability to deny air power, but don't give the excuse to Putin to turn this into something that it isn't. This is Putin's aggression and Putin's violence. This is not in any way a justified defence of the Russian people.
One final thought, if we can, Tom Tugendhat, and that's on UK politics. Famously, you are one of those rare political beasts. When asked about the scope of your political ambitions, when asked if you want to be Prime Minister, you say, of course, why wouldn't I want to be Prime Minister? The polls have closed recently. The Conservatives have enjoyed, forgive me if this sounds frivolous or flippant, but they've enjoyed a sort of Ukraine bounce, and the idea that they can put Partygate behind them and Boris Johnson can bestride the world stage has helped, it seems, his electoral fortunes. I note that Andrew Bridgen, who put one of those letters into the 1922 committee, I think is today going to say he's withdrawn it. The tide seems to be turning for Boris Johnson.
Well, look, I've always wanted Conservative leaders to win. The whole point about being a Conservative politician is to make sure we get the best policies for the United Kingdom. I happen to think they're Conservative. Of course I do. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing as a Conservative Member of Parliament. So what we want to see, what we need to see as a country is the kind of policies that transform our country and they get us out of the it's now going to be three crises, really, that have hit us recently, which is COVID and the economic impact of it. And now, of course, the economic impact of this war. And we need real Conservative policies to deliver that change. And that's about, increasing our defence and making sure that our tax policies and our levelling up policies and so on are right. Now, if the Prime Minister can deliver that, fantastic. That's exactly what we need to see. But that doesn't change the answer I always give. And people ask it as though it's a gotcha question. It's not a gotcha question. You've always been ambitious, Colin. You've got a fantastic job, and you've always wanted to have a voice in the national news, and you've got it. And of course, you should be ambitious. I think we should be ambitious for ourselves, for our communities, and for our country. And I think you need to be honest about it too. I've always found it somewhat odd when some politicians say "trust me," but then won't answer the basic question, the first basic question, honestly.
Tom Tugendhat is chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, being as candid as ever. Tom, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot.